Hello, hello. How are we doing today, everyone? Welcome back. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today I want to talk to you guys about the inversion of Christian virtues. Now, some of you guys may have actually saw the title of this stream a little earlier, and it was on beta male inversions of Christian virtues. I still think that is entirely consistent with the message of today's video, but I had a couple people have feedback, and I didn't want the title of today's videos to potentially drive away a future viewer because maybe of their thoughts on my use of beta male. So even though we're going to get into why, the worldly inversions of these virtues, because within a context of a Christian theology, the masculinity, the man, the strong man, doesn't have to do with muscles. It has to do with the embodiment of these virtues that we're going to discuss today. And so if you're going to invert those by definition, being that if you look up what's the definition of a beta male is somebody who is submissive to the world, submissive to authority, that they obviously would invert these values. But anyways, we're just going to use a general characteristic today to describe our conversation about how Christian values can become inverted. We're going to be talking about faith, hope, knowledge, wisdom, honesty, humility, obedience, patience, courage, faithfulness, self-control, kindness, and gratitude. So all these different things, we're going to be hitting on how they can become inverted, or how the world presents these virtues as things that people think they're participating in, when in reality what they're doing is very divorced from how we'd understand these concepts. So that is what we're going to be doing today. I do want to first give thanks to everybody who has gone and signed up over at the website davidpatrickcarey.com/register. I will share that link with you guys here in the chat. Again, don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do want to tell everyone how thankful I am who have gone over to the website and signed up. Again, there's 2 video libraries of educational content, theology, life stories, religion, and then there's one just on personal fitness and lifestyle, stuff like that. But if that's something you'd be interested in, or you just want to help out once a month for $5, I would greatly, greatly appreciate you guys signing up there. Also, if you are interested in more of my day-to-day activities, although I'm trying to really get off these big tech platforms, as I know most of you guys are, I've spent so much time building up on like Instagram, for example, and now it's like, geez, do I throw it away? Do I go somewhere else? I mean, I guess like most people, we're just going to stay on these platforms as long as we can. I will make a brief comment on the activities today within Washington, D.C., and maybe what that signifies for all of us. But again, if you are able, please sign up over at the website. If you're interested in sort of my day-to-day activities, you can follow me over on Instagram. But really the place where I'm trying to move most of the operation for Church of the Eternal Logos is over to gab.com. So I hope you guys have gone over to Gab and actually signed up. Here is my link over at gab.com/DPHARRY. It's the same handle that I have on multiple platforms. And then also, guys, where I'm going to begin to really post all my backup stuff, all the streams, is going to be over on the Rumble channel. So I just created a brand new Rumble channel called COTEL, C-O-T-E-L, obviously an acronym for Church of the Eternal Logos. So if that's something, please find me on BitChute or Rumble. I think Rumble is going to be an ideal place for everything. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there before we got going. So thank you guys. Thank you very, very much. And also, we should have a very special stream Friday. I think Dylan, potentially Friday. We haven't set the time in stone yet. Again, he's in South Africa. But Dylan from Existential Delight, I think we're going to do a stream going over quotes from G.K. Chesterton. So G.K. Chesterton, I have a couple books that I've read from him. But we're just going to grab a bunch of quotes and kind of go through some of his sort of paradoxical tidbits of wisdom, potentially Friday or Saturday. So keep an eye out for that. So, all right. Now, with that all taken care of, let's get into today's stream. We are going to be looking at the inversion of Christian virtues. Now, obviously, this YouTube channel is coming at this conversation from an Orthodox theological perspective. So we don't have the same framework maybe other people, like we don't have the 7 deadly sins like you'd find in Catholicism and obviously adopted by many Protestants. We also don't have the same concept in regards to a relegated, distinct set of virtues because of our understandings of the energy essence distinction. So the Orthodox theological approach to Christian virtues is going to be a little different. It's not just this neat little box. What we're doing is actually interacting with the uncreated energies of the Logos. And so I found this nice article over on the Orthodox Church of America website, even though, yes, they certainly have been doing activities lately that don't seem very orthodox, to say the least. But you know how their website tends to have a lot of good things. They have a series of articles that are called The Virtues. And again, it's addressing these multiple virtues that I want to talk to you guys about, how we understand that from a Christian or an Orthodox Christian theological perspective, and then how it's so obviously being inverted in today's society. So what I wanted to do to begin before we got into the first virtue is actually read this little overview that they had on the virtues. And so that's what we're going to begin with. And he said, again, I'll just share the link. So if you guys actually want to follow along with today's stream, here is the link. I'm going to throw it down in the live chat right now. That link will take you to the page that I'm using as we methodically move through our conversation on Christian virtues and how they're actually inverted. So I'm going to read the first one on the virtues, and it reads, in addition to the Beatitudes of Jesus, there are many fruits of the Holy Spirit enumerated in the apostolic scriptures and referred to in the writings of the saints of the church. These fruits of the Spirit are often called the Christian virtues, which literally means those powers and possessions of the mind and the heart which all men should have if they are truly human, fulfilling themselves as created in the image and likeness of God. Generally speaking, all of the human virtues are attributes of God himself. Again, they are the characteristics of Jesus Christ, the divine Son of God in human flesh. They are divine properties which should be in all human persons by the gift of God in creation and salvation through Christ. It has been said, and it is true, that the Christian virtues are not all particularly, quote, Christian in the sense that only Christians know about them and are committed to attain them. Most, if not all, of the Christian virtues have been honored, respected, or recommended by all great teachers of the spiritual life. This is in no way detracts from their Christian value and truth, for Christ and his apostles and saints have not taught and practiced something other than that which all men should teach and practice. As the fulfillment of all positive human aspirations and desires, it is quite understandable that Jesus Christ, the perfect, quote, man from heaven, the, quote, final Adam, unquote, should fulfill and realize in himself that which all men of wisdom and goodwill have sought for and desired in their minds and hearts, enlightened by God. For in truth, whatever is found in man is to be good and beautiful and true is found there because of God and is from God. This is the case, whether it is realized or not. Quote, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And it is Christ himself, the eternal Son and Logos and Word of God, who is the light and life of every man who has ever lived and been enlightened on the earth. Reference to John 1, verse 1 through 10. Thus the Apostle Paul has counseled Christ faithful. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about those things. Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. As we, quote, think about those things, unquote, we will refer to the teaching of the apostle himself and to all the apostles and teachers of the Christian faith who have been enlightened and inspired by God through the Lord Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church. And so that is our opening conversation in framing the virtues. The virtues. So what are the virtues, and how are the virtues being inverted in contemporary society? So faith, let's begin there. What is faith? Faith is obviously the fundamental virtue of the saints. This is how the church often refers to it. And so when we look at faith, as our article would read, the foundation of all Christian virtue in life is faith. Faith is the natural possession of all men who are wise and virtuous. For if a person lacks faith in man's ability to know, to do good, and to find meaning in life, if he does not believe that this is possible, profitable, and worthy of man's efforts, then nothing wise or virtuous can be achieved. The striking characteristic of all prophets of doom, apostles of despair, and preachers of absurdity is their absence of faith and man's capabilities for goodness and truth, and the absence of faith in the meaning and value of good. Or the meaning and value of life, It is also in the absence of faith in God. For faith in God is the fundamental virtue of all saints. The prototype of the believer in God is Abraham, the father of Israel. And so now let's move our attention from theology. We can understand faith, faith being the way in which we give our undivided commitment to God, to the thing unseen. And so how is this being inverted in the contemporary world? Well, the first question I think is obviously posed if we're looking at faith. How is faith being expressed in contemporary terms? Is we would ask ourselves, what are we putting our faith in? And so right there is an easy way to begin to bifurcate who is putting their faith in God and who is putting their faith in other forms of authority. So I think the first comment then, obviously I could branch off into all these different things, politics, COVID, all these different. But the first one I think is important is the psychic schism of secularism itself. Because one of the problems that I would say in regarding the inversion of faith is even by people who claim to be faithful to Christ himself. So if we think about maybe potentially Protestants or people of various Christian denominations that have grown up in a secular society, have adopted post-Enlightenment worldviews, which is going to be the case for, again, most Northern European and obviously Canada, America, Australia, is that they are placed in a sort of, again, just within their cultural context, in a sort of presuppositional framework where secularism insinuates that God is only present within the church and not within society. So secularism, growing up in secular societies, creates a compartmentalized and limited conception of God by definition. And so because of that limited and compartmentalized framework in which God exists, whether people are totally conscientious of it or not, God then can't be the ultimate authority in all aspects of life, right? For those who have undivided faith or undevoted faith to God, God is present in all aspects of life, in your politics, in your relationships, obviously on Sunday, but they're on Friday evening. All aspects of your life are informed by God because God isn't limited as in the secular schematic that God is only relegated to the church. God is only relegated potentially to the home, although we're going to see the attacks on that coming, obviously, in the immediate future. But I think the first thing when we talk about faith and the question of what are we actually putting our faith in as a society is the problem of ultimate authority itself. And that within the secular mindset, so many people are really going to be have a fractured understanding of the power and ultimacy of God himself. So because within secularism, now we have compartmentalized understandings of authority. And so now let's fast forward to 2020. Now let's fast forward to COVID. Now let's fast forward to a pandemic in which people's faith in the ultimacy of God is being challenged in regards to their faith in the authority of man-made institutions, and in the authority of Fauci, in the authority of the CDC, the World Health Organization, in the authority of Trump, in the authority of his Warp Speed project, all these different things. People then devote their faith to, as opposed to, again, having God front and center. And so then look at the closing down of churches. Look at the quote-unquote faithful. And we can see how faith is inverted into an absolute allegiance to the institutions of this world. That's how faith is being inverted. Again, I think the origin of that problem is going to be rooted within secularism to a degree, because if we grew up with a phronema, if you will, in which there isn't this massive schism between God and society, between politics and the church, even though the church isn't political, but if you were to follow the teachings of the church, they're going to put you in one political camp, obviously. Hey, by the way, guys, could you please smash the like button? I see we got new people have just joined. Go ahead and smash that like if you can. Would greatly, greatly appreciate that. So we see then the way faith is being inverted in the contemporary way is this sort of compartmentalized form of authority. See, if you believe in God, the authority of God should resonate in all aspects of life. But if ultimately, because of the presupposition of secularism, God is relegated to a specific dimension of society, of your life, well then what takes authority when it comes to health? Is it Bill Gates? Is it the vaccines? Is it all this different stuff? And so we see then the questioning of, what? You don't believe in science? You don't believe in science? Because now we see the real underpinnings of people's worldviews and their real allegiance in regards to authoritative understandings. And so it's not that people, as we've talked about in previous streams, when I've come up against people who want to talk about, oh, you don't believe in science, this or that, if you want to get into the vaccine or the larger statistical data regarding COVID-19, that they themselves don't even know science. So this whole thing about you don't believe in science is, what are they appealing to? Because clearly they're not appealing to a direct one-on-one conversation of who can more accurately describe reality using measurement and averages. That's the scientific method. We become to know the world by measuring and taking averages of it. This is how science works. So it's not like when you debate with these people, it's not like well, how do we use this methodology that I call science, the scientific method, and who is actually becoming closer and closer to the facts of the case, right? Whether we're looking at vaccines, whether we're looking at the mortality rate of COVID-19, that's not what they're interested in. What they're interested in is faith, but an inverted form of faith. It's faith in regards to your allegiance to the institutions of authority. It's regards to your allegiance to don't you know what the World Health Organization said? Don't you know what the CDC has said? And then go ahead and contradict themselves months later, but we'll go ahead with the societal mask mandate despite the CDC taking that back, or the fact that they've re-corrected their mortality numbers. Doesn't matter. Because what is the faith in? The faith is ultimately in these institutions, and we're going to see as we move through these Christian virtues how this taints and inverts all these other virtues, how the participation in irrationality begins to divorce or obliterates, destroys, undermines the integrity of one's own epistemology, of one's worldview. And so we'll see the relativism and all this stuff, how it seeps in. And so what is, again, man having faith in besides the institutions? Well, because he has this loyal devotion to institutional authority, by product, he also has an allegiance to the concept of progress. And this is where so many conservatives or those of the right of center, they're still bought into post-Enlightenment worldview that we're somehow progressing, right? Just since the Industrial Revolution, we're moving forward quicker and quicker and quicker. But that means that we negate the reality of the bifurcation of gender. This is progress. progress is really the reversion, the moving away from the natural order. We've talked about this before and how we actually define progress. So faith, what does faith embody for the contemporary person, for the contemporary non-believer? Well, faith is this faith in the institutions. Faith is somehow this faith in like central planning, this ambiguous, amorphous concept that somehow all the brightest and the smartest, that they'll work it out. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to take responsibility. And so it's just continual progress towards those ends. Unfortunately, that isn't faith in God. And faith in God, ironically, when we look at this inversion of faith, faith in God requires you to actually take on more responsibility upon yourself and your life and for those around you. Faith in the institutions, the inversion of faith, actually requires you to take less and less responsibility, right? And so when we've talked about before the archetype, Christ is way more than an archetype. What we were talking about, one semiotic way, one form of meaning that we can extract from him actually destroying and defeating death is how him dying for the sins of the world is the ultimate act of responsibility, and how when men want to mature, how men want more meaning in their lives, right? We all are faced with the nihilism that of 2021 now. If you really want meaning in your life, take on more responsibility. And so it's interestingly then we see, of course, meaning comes from God. Meaning itself is an uncreated energy. So as we take on more responsibility, as we then have more meaning in our lives, we actually move towards God. But when we take less responsibility in our lives, and then who takes on that responsibility? Usually a centralized force. Well, in America now, that's just corporations. Corporations continually make life more and more and more and more convenient. So that convenience is allowing people to take less responsibility, and therefore they're actually, the hedonism that they are engrossed in is less and less meaningful. And it's funny how too that lack of responsibility and the sort of materialistic comforts that a lot of the corporations are controlling, manipulate American society with, I think it's also led to poor parenting. And so when you look at the average parent then in the 21st century, not all of them, of course not, and in many Christians are the good ones, but I think we can see how and this is going to get to the Christian virtue of patience too, because that's going to be all about endurance and how patience in this world, we don't have a real, I'm not very patient at all. So it's something I have to work on, but people want things to be more and more comfortable, which is actually the opposite of Christian virtues and how we would understand our movement through this world from birth to death. But anyways, I think that pretty much sums up faith. So faith, we see is not that man has faith in God as he should, but he has faith in institutions. He has faith in these centralized forms of intelligence, whether it be globalism, the UN, the EU, the U.S. government, whatever you want to call these bureaucratic hive minds, that man begins to have more and more faith in these things, less and less faith in God, I think rooted within the compartmentalization of secularism itself, that God's relegated to a particular point in society. And because man then devotes actual allegiance to these institutions, whether he's conscientious of or not, whether he goes to church on Sunday or not, that what he does is, one, have a faux form of meaning. He has to adapt or adopt the idea of continual progress because of it. And yeah, so we pretty much hit that one. Let's go to the next one now. The next virtue that I wanted to talk to you guys about is hope. Oh, shoot, I forgot to put faith up there when I was talking about it. Let's put the next one up there. So now we're going to get into hope. Hope. So what is hope? How does hope a Christian virtue? How do we understand hope? So The virtue of hope goes together with the power of faith. Our article reads, the patriarch Abraham, quote, in hope believed against hope that he should be the father of many nations, unquote. Romans chapter 4, verse 18. And hope, like faith, is in that which is not seen. Quote, for this hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Reference to Romans 8, verses 24 through 25. Now, this is really insightful, I think. What I want to highlight then with hope is this whole concept that's being presented to us in Romans chapter 8, verse 24 and 25. What is it presenting to us? That hope is non-visible. Interesting. So now let's extrapolate and unpack that idea. What was the motif? What was the euphemism? What was the phrase for the Obama campaign? It was hope, right? And so we see the world. How does it manipulate? Christian theology says our hope is in things unseen. How then does the father of lies, the father of manipulation, the father of deception, then manipulate people in the world? He gives you forms of hope that you can visibly see. So what do we get? We get a Barack Obama. We get a colored man. We get visible forms of hope, right? Oh my gosh, the first African-American president. Look at the enthusiasm. Look at the emotional fervor. Look at the societal impact and momentum that causes. But what did they get in that hope? It's a false form of hope. It was the same agenda. It was the same thing. It was the same powers that be moving and operating the world as they always have. So what was the hope? The hope, the deception is whenever hope is presented as something you can see. Hope is not Donald Trump. Look what just happened with all the QAnons. Look at the hope that they had. Who is their hope in? Who was their hope? Was it in God? Well, they sure made passing references to Christianity. They made passing references to God and Christ and all this stuff. But ultimately, their hope was in an idealistic worship of Trump. That their hope was in this idea of this underground patriot army that was going to come and rescue everybody from the satanic pedophiles. And it's not that there aren't satanic pedophiles. It's that the whole thing was to pacify you. It was to nullify you. It was to get you out of the way because you placed your hope in the world. And that's what a lot of people are coming to terms with today. Inauguration Day. We now have President Joe Biden in the White House in America. First day. Awkward to say that, but Look at the events that transpired. Look at the hope. Look at the hope within the Trump administration. I know that I began this by sort of poking fun or at least highlighting the hope phrasing that was intended for Barack Obama. And then what do we get? The same military-industrial complex, the same critical race transition of American values within that 8-year period. Imagine, when Obama ran for president in 2008, he was against same-sex marriage. Mind you, in 2014, then, 2 years before he transitions power, he lights the entire White House up in the pride flag. Within 2 presidential terms, the majority values of marriage in this country radically changed. And so the hope, what was life better for African Americans in this country, for people of color under Barack Obama? Of course not. Of course not. But the hope, the deception, the inversion of hope in this world is that hope is presented as something you can see. It's Donald Trump. It's Barack Obama. It's the QAnon phenomenon. It's InfoWars. Whatever it is, we have to realize that our hope is not within men. Our hope is not within institutions. We can fight for those things. We can respect freedom fighters and truth seekers and truth tellers. And we can see and align with other people and form out, allyship with other people. But our hope cannot be in them. They will not save us. And so think of the heartbreak all these Q people have to face. Think of the realization that they have been manipulated for years. Think of all the number 17s they thought they saw, all the Qs they thought they saw. I mean, that is earth-shattering. That is world-shattering. That is difficult to swallow, that to come to the realization that you were that gullible. And most likely you were used by the opponents who actually hate you to manipulate your patriotic fervor against you and your own objectives. And that's exactly what happened. So the question then we ask ourselves, and when we come to hope, is what is the basis of our optimism looking forward? That's what hope is. Hope is that we should be always looking forward with optimism. To have despair is to be sinful. We are never to be in despair as Christians, even though we are told we'll be persecuted. We're told not to despair. So, I think false hope is given visibly, as I said. And so the whole frame, the phrase, see it to believe it, see it to believe it. If we're Christians, should we ever be using that phrase? I mean, of course we can, here, little circumstances, here or there, just saying things. But generally speaking, trying to be much more nuanced and critical in the way we're looking at things. Should we really believe things based on their visible presentation? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Especially when it comes to things of God, when it comes to things of hope and optimism for the future. These are unseen. When it comes to our faith and our hope, you cannot see these things. And that, to agree, that's why they're powerful, right? It's when the atheist argument, well, if God was real, how come I can't see him? I mean, do you believe in logic? You do believe in logic. Can you touch logic? You can't touch logic. So logic is real or not real? Okay, so if logic is real and you can't touch logic, you're probably going to have to use non-visible ways to prove something non-visible like God. That's usually outside their capacity, but that's another conversation. So hope then is also, where is hope misplaced? How is hope inverted in the contemporary world? And I would say an obvious way, a beginning, is the hope in ourselves, is that our hope is ultimately within God and the providence of God's will. And that's where our hope is, because we know that however bad things are, in the end, we win. In the end, we win. But too many people in today's society, they place their hope in themselves. And I would say this is something that I myself, we all probably fall victim to this one way or another, is, for me, I have, when we get to the patience part, that is one area I have to work better at in regards to my Christian virtues, is patience. I am not the most patient person in the world, for sure. But people put hope in themselves and expect them to do it all. Again, it's going to inflate one's ego. It's going to dramatically inflate one's pride. It's going to potentially lead one down a road towards narcissism, especially if you're a competent individual, right? That's the nasty part, is that if you actually are a competent individual and you can actually get things done, you can actually do things, you actually have skills and talents. If you put all your hope in yourself, eventually you're going to hit a dead end. Eventually that's going to be tragedy. But for a while, you're probably going to get by with it. You're actually probably going to be successful in the world. And that is a dangerous road. Many of us have traversed that and had to find out the hard way. Obviously, as I said before with the faith, is that people have put their hope and trust and faith in men. We as Christians are not called to ever do that. We are not called to put our trust in men. I don't care. Again, look, that's why today is such a useful day to go over our Christian virtues, to understand how we as men are called to be Christians and be strong Christians and act in the world, because how many people are having to face, again, the manipulation they were under throughout the whole Trump presidency because of the Q phenomenon or whatever it may be, purely putting their hope in men. And so there was a part that I wanted to read in regards to the section on hope from our article. And so let me read to you guys a few things that I thought was really good. So the opposite of hope is despondency and despair. According to the spiritual tradition of the Orthodox Church, the state of despondency and despair is the most grievous and horrible condition that a person can be in. It is the worst and most harmful and the sinful states possible for the soul. Do not fall victim to despondency and despair, despite whatever is going on in the world right now. Our hope is not here. Our hope is beyond. We have to see the light behind the shadows that are in front of us. The loss of hope is the worst possible state because without hope, nothing else is possible. Certainly not faith. If a person is faithless, he can be chastised and convinced. If a person is proud, he can be humbled. Impure, he can be cleansed. Weak, he can be strengthened. Wicked, he can be made righteous. But if a person is despondent and despairing, the very condition of his sickness is such that his heart and soul are dead and unresponsive to the grace of God and to the support of his brothers and sisters. This is from St. Isaac of Syria. The force of despondence overwhelms him and oppresses his soul. And this is a taste of hell because it produces 1,000 temptations, confusion, irritation, protesting, and bewailing one's lot, wrong thoughts, wandering from place to place, and so on. The demon of despondency, this is from Evagrius Ponticus. The demon of despondency, which is called the noonday demon, reference to Psalm chapter 91, verse 6, is more grievous than all others. It arouses in him vexation against the place and mode of life itself and his work, adding that there is no more love among the brethren and no one to comfort him. Then it provokes in him a longing for other places. So let's continue. The only remedy for despair is humility and patience, the steadfast holding of the life of faith, even without conviction or feeling. It is the simplification of life by going through each day, one day at a time, with the continual observances, however external, of scriptural reading, liturgical worship, fasting, prayer, and work. I want to skip through here, skipping forward. Then it says, sometimes people think that a certain lack of hope is a Christian virtue. They think that by proclaiming that, quote, all is lost, unquote, they please God by their humility and sorrow over sins, their own and those of the world. They think that the more they concentrate on the evils of men, the more they exalt the strength of the wicked, the more they say, quote, there is no help for us in God, unquote, the more righteous and pious they become. But this is all wrong. It has nothing to do with the patient suffering at the hands of the wicked and the patient struggle against the powers of evil that the righteous must endure, being absolutely certain that their ultimate and total victory is in God, the source of their strength and their hope. There is no virtue to feel weak and helpless in the presence of the wicked. There is no virtue to consider oneself totally at the mercy of evil and sin, and it is a virtue rather to be always, quote, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, and knowing and believing that the final victory is of God's. Reference to Romans 12:12. So I think that is a good reminder for all of us, given the current circumstances in which we find ourselves. So we must have faith and we must have hope. What is the next virtue that I wanted to talk to you guys about? It is knowledge. Knowledge. So let me change up here. Let me go to knowledge. Okay. So knowledge is the next one. What is not seen is believed on the basis of what is seen. And so faith and hope go together with knowledge. They are built on knowledge and lead to knowledge. For what is not seen is believed and hoped on the basis of what is seen. And the misunderstanding of what is seen depends on belief and hope and what is not seen. A sort of vicious little feedback loop there. One's belief and hope in the ability to know, to trust his senses, his mind, and the revelation of his God are the foundations of all knowledge. And that's going to be the point of our discussion today in regards to then how is knowledge inverted. And it's going to begin with really how we understand 1 Corinthians. And so let me read that to you guys real quick. I got my Orthodox study Bible. And so we're going to be reading 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 through 23. And it's the subsection in regard to the Orthodox study Bible. It's Wisdom in Christ's Church. And it reads, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, quote, He catches the wise in their own craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. Therefore, let not boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death, or things present, or things to come, all are yours, and you are Christ, and Christ is God's." And so the problem with the wisdom of this world, right? And so the footnote, even in our Orthodox study Bible, reads, "The wisdom of this world is attractive and reasonable, and on the surface appears to be true. But such earthly wisdom denies God and leads us away from Him, not to fulfillment, but to death. True wisdom and life are found only in Christ and our total abandonment to the love of God and neighbor." And so that right there is going to highlight for us how knowledge is inverted in the world, in society. And so it's really going to even tie back to, if we wanted to get more expansive in our analysis, it goes back to really the way in which we do apologetics with the transcendental argument. It has to do with the critique that everybody has a fundamental beginning point. What is your beginning point? What is your presupposition? What is your paradigmatic framework in which you're approaching the conversation? Knowledge, then, for the Christian has to begin with the assumption of God and the revelation of Scripture. It is through here that we establish our epistemology. It is through the revelation of God that we understand how it is we come to know the world, what it is we know. And so, if we depend upon the wisdom of this world, the pagan wisdom, if you will, though aspects are true, right? We have the concept in Orthodoxy related to Saint Justin Martyr of logos spermaticos, that there's sperm, there's seeds of logos present in all different world religions to different degrees, but we have a single epistemology, that is logos theology, if you will, or phallogocentrism. And the world then, what is the basis of their epistemology? It's going to come from observing the world, really natural theology, observation of the fallen world. And it's because the world is fallen that wisdom within this context is ultimately foolishness, even though you can know a lot of facts. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about, is the difference between knowledge and information. How is knowledge inverted in the contemporary context, in contemporary society? And I would say one way in which it's inverted is our definition of what knowledge is. Knowledge should be things leading back to God, the source of knowledge itself, because knowledge by definition is the idea that somehow you can attain statements, concepts about reality that are true. That's what makes it knowledgeable, that there is a sort of objective truth. If there is no objective truth, everything is just information. And I think this is a fundamental distinction that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds, that knowledge depends on the objectivity of truth. Information depends on this idea of just selectivity, almost, again, relativism. I think it would lead in that direction. But there's a few things I wanted to read then in our article. It says, man was created to know God, not only to believe in him and to hope in him, but to know him, and so to love him and to serve him. Knowledge of God is the aim and goal of man's life, the purpose of his creation by God. And this is a reference to John chapter 17, reads, and this is eternal life, that they know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. O righteous Father, the world has not known thee, and these know that thou hast sent me. I made known to them thy name, and I will make it known, that the love with which thou hast loved me may be in them, and I in them. Reference to John chapter 17. Faith given as a gift by God results in the knowledge of God. The Lord desires that man would, quote, know the truth, and so become free from all blindness, ignorance, and sin. Reference to John chapter 8, verse 32. This is the central teaching of the Lord Jesus Christ, of the law of the prophets of the Old Testament, and the apostles and teachers of the church. That this is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 through 7, that men might know wisdom and instruction, understand words of insight, receive instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. The prudence may be given to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so let's look at then contemporary world. How many people's worldview begins, one, with the presupposition that knowledge of anything, or knowledge in general, assuming objective truth, has to in one way lead back to a sort of better understanding of God or his creation or something of that nature? I would say not a lot of people. And so the fear of the Lord, as it said in regards to Proverbs, is the beginning of all knowledge. Not many people are also fearing the Lord. And so knowledge then, I think, has given this false framework where people are just consuming information. And so the vacuous nature of their lives, right? There's not a whole lot of meaning there. You would think that somebody who becomes really knowledgeable, somebody who has more knowledge, would actually have more meaning. And I would say for many, that's not the case, because what they're actually attaining isn't knowledge. What they're attaining is information. You might as well just be looking up baseball statistics or, football statistics. That's like a set of factual information. Does that contribute to what we would call in a larger context knowledge of thyself, knowledge of the larger, grander questions of reality, knowledge of God? Of course not. Of course. Not that those things can't be interesting and useful as distractions from everyday life. Yes, they can be. But knowledge is not information. And so what does everybody frame the contemporary landscape as? Is that we're swimming in information. We're drowning in information. We have an abundance of information, yet at the same time, we lack knowledge as individuals, as peoples, as a society, as a nation. As a civilization, as Western civilization, we lack knowledge. How can that be the case? We have so much information. We have so much science. We're doing so much sciencing, right? We're doing so much sciencing around here. We're doing so much progressing around here. How come there isn't more knowledge? How come there isn't more real meaning? And it's because it's the things that people are consuming as knowledge are compartmentalized. One reason I think that we can differentiate knowledge, I think real knowledge is so interconnected to so many different things. That's why it gives you power. It gives you perspective. It allows you to connect the dots. Whereas in information, it's just compartmentalized. It can be very dense, right? How much statistical data can you get for any phenomenon? And that's a lot of information, but how much knowledge does it give you? And so in our world, people think they're pursuing knowledge when they're pursuing information. And those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes they are. Often they're not. And so the way that knowledge then has been inverted in today's world is people are swimming in a sea of information, and whether that information is true, whether that relates to an objective reality, whether that relates to the objective reality of God, is a side note. It doesn't matter. And that then is filling people up with the McDonald's. There's no difference then with the food they consume and the information they consume, because it's still vacuous. It doesn't have real sustenance to it. It doesn't have real sustenance to it. And so is it a major conspiracy then that I think many of us who have got more serious about our spirituality have got more serious about our diets? No, because they're both a sort of appetite. They both feed. One feeds your body, the other feeds your mind. But you need something with real sustenance, or you're not going to grow. And so we want to grow. We want to expand ourselves. We want to become more like God. So that is knowledge. The next one I want to get into is wisdom. Wisdom. So wisdom, let us attend. Wisdom differs from knowledge in that wisdom is the immediate insight into things, seeing clearly and deeply the mysteries of God. So this I want to make a distinction, because now we've just moved in, we've gone from knowledge to wisdom, and that may seem difficult to distinguish, right? It seems like, okay, well, your framework for knowledge and information is going to be the framework that I would tend to think for wisdom and knowledge. And I would say, no, knowledge and wisdom, a way in which we can understand the differences of these within a Christian context, is really just being learned and being unlearned, and then the ability to pronounce truth, insightful truths about the nature of reality. An unlearned individual who's 80 years old, that's why we would call him the wise man or the wise woman, is that they can see deeply into reality. It's not because they read a bunch of books. Even though the Christian man who has a lot of knowledge, reading information about God, connecting dots together, learning, putting putting everything together, connecting the dots, if you will, right? That wisdom is a sort of experiential understanding. It's almost it's God's knowledge, if you will, passing at a sort of almost through like osmosis, if you will. So like our article, I want to show you what our article talks about with wisdom, because in the Old Testament, a whole body of literature developed concerning the theme of divine wisdom. The Psalms, Proverbs, and other wisdom writings such as Ecclesiastes and the Wisdom of Solomon and Jesus and Son of Sirach show clearly what wisdom is and what it means to be wise. So what does it mean to be wise? And so we get an excerpt from Proverbs chapter 8 here. And so it reads, "Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, in the path she takes her stand, beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals she cries aloud, quote, 'To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the sons of men. O simple ones, learn prudence. O foolish men, pay attention. Hear, for I will not speak noble things. For I speak noble things. And from my lips will come what is right, and from my mouth will utter truth. Wickedness is an abomination to my lips,' unquote. All the words of my mouth are righteous. There is nothing twisted or crooked in them. They are all straight to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. I, wisdom, dwell in prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength." Proverbs chapter 8, verse 1 through 14. Also, I wanted to read this section. It says, in the church, as St. Paul says, the divine wisdom is given to the spiritual person, the wise man, who possesses the Spirit of God, can show forth the, quote, knowledge of salvation to his people, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace, unquote. Reference to Luke. The opposite of divine wisdom is sinful foolishness, which brings men to calamity, sorrow, ruin, and death. Reference to Proverbs chapter 10. In the spiritual life of the church, it is the wise men, the spiritual masters and saintly teachers who have gained divine wisdom and so are made competent to direct and guide the destiny of men's immortal souls. It is for this reason that all men should submit themselves to their instruction and rule. And so, wisdom, like I said, differs from knowledge in that it has to do with the immediate insight into things, seeing clearly and deeply the mysteries of God. And so, you can imagine one studied and trained in theology, erudite in the books that they've read, very learned and articulate, and yet foolish and lack wisdom. So wisdom and knowledge aren't necessarily the same thing, though they go hand in hand together. And so how is wisdom, a Christian virtue, being inverted in contemporary society? And if wisdom is the immediate insight into things, if wisdom is the ability to better understand the mysteries of God, wisdom then should be able to better see the patterns of lived reality. And because of that, look at modern society, look at America, look at today's Inauguration Day. Now, I'm sure many of us have similar opinions on the legitimacy, probably have similar opinions on the allegiance of those who are now in power, but we saw basically a Bolshevik Revolution 2.0. How much wisdom as a nation do we have if we can watch these things play out before us and do nothing? Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. And how wise are the people who are doing them? Obviously, they don't have much wisdom either because of the undercutting of the self-destructive nature of evil. And really what we're up against, that is the forces that always want to centralize, that want to dominate, that want to get you more and more subservient and dependent upon them. They obviously don't have wisdom because they're in opposition to God, and wisdom would be an uncreated energy of Christ, of the Logos. It's an epithet of the Logos. But we see the same destructive patterns play out over and over and over in front of us. The same societal degeneracy, the same ethical and moral degradation of our cultures, of our traditions. And this obviously is the absence of wisdom. What we're told is wisdom, right? So what are we told wisdom is in the contemporary inverted context? Well, what is wise? Well, it's wisdom really is just allegiance. Again, I know I keep saying this sort of same thing over and over again, but wisdom really is just the allegiance to the institutional narrative. That wisdom, because wisdom is a moving in a deeper understanding, a deeper perception of God's mysteries, they themselves are moving so far in opposition to it that there's no other way to define wisdom in that context, using the way that we as Christians would define wisdom. There's no other way to describe the way that they're encountering it other than redefining it as the institutional narrative or progressivism or globalism or just whatever the institutional narrative, to move people essentially away further and further and further and further away from God. That's what is happening. So it's the same historical patterns, and all of them are moving in opposition to God. And so we can see how this certainly has to do with a sort of tainting of people's nous. If we're going to get into anthropology, an Orthodox anthropology of the individual, is their ability to even recognize God, their ability to even recognize the right? The immediate insight into things, the immediate mystery of God. They can't even see it. They can't even see it. They can't recognize them because their news, the eyes of the heart, the eyes of the soul have been tainted so much. That is why they're blind. And they need Christ to give them that light, to give them sight back again. But they're not going to get that. And so wisdom then is just the knowledge of this world. The fallen knowledge of this world is just repackaged as wisdom. And you can, however you want to reframe that. I mean, just grab a modern idea, and I think it'd be probably consistent with that. So that's all I have to say about wisdom. So we can move on from there. The next one I wanted to get into is honesty. Honesty is the next Christian virtue. And so honesty, the wise man who has knowledge lives according to the truth through a totally honest life. Honesty means, first of all, to speak the truth and never to bear false witness. Reference to Exodus chapter 20. There are 6 things which the Lord hates, 7 which are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to do evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and a man who sows discord among brothers. Honesty also means to act truly and openly without pretense or the presentation of a false image of oneself. It means, in a word, not to be a hypocrite. And so, where would I end if I just wanted to expand upon hypocrisy and looking at, given our article, the sort of Orthodox framework, we've seen that hypocrisy is sort of the inversion of honesty. Honesty here is our Christian virtue. And so just highlighting a little bit, obviously we live in a time of immense hypocrisy. Is that different than any other time in human history? Maybe not. Maybe not. But it seems with, again, the information age, with the prevalence of information, with the interconnectivity of the technocracy around us, that hypocrisy and lies and propaganda can be presented to us at such a higher rate than maybe before. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. But hypocrisy, when you look at almost modern progressive values and everything that they advocate for, it itself is hypocritical at almost every level. So they want to, I really don't even, I think it's so low IQ, I don't even want to get into it, but they talk about democracy, even though, again, we can talk about the detriments of democracy, mob rule, all this stuff, republic, yada, yada, yada. Yep, got it all. But we just saw the fraudulent election that just transpired in this country, and then they wanted, the Capitol Hill. Yep, another hypocrisy. Hypocrisy about, again, not a big Trump fan, but Trump, you want to talk about Trump, Russia, then we see China, Swalwell, Biden, Ukraine, yada, yada, yada. Yep, hypocrisy. We want to talk about, loving people and social justice, and then we can talk about anti-white, anti-male sentiment and the advocacy for actual violence against these people in the name of love and toleration. Another hypocrisy. So we live in a time which almost everything, because of the father of lies, because ultimately that's who we're up against. We're up against the father of lies. So I want to do a stream in the future. I think it's going to be called like decoding or translating or deconstruct, something like that. Probably decoding globalist legalese and just looking at all the phrases that were given and how it means the opposite, right? So previously in another stream, I was talking about how violence is redefined within the sort of globalist agenda, as violence is really anything that is stopping their or expressing opposition to their agenda. And then actual violence working in favor of their agenda, that's usually peaceful protest or something of that nature. So again, hypocrisy. But I'd love to do a stream just going through all those terms and looking at how everything we're presented with, because of the father of lies, because ultimately this is who we're up against. Because of the father of lies, whatever we're again in the false hope, right? Hope's always being presented visibly to us in the fallen world. That I'm sorry, I just lost my thread. I was just talking about honesty and geez, totally just lost my thread there. Anyways, honesty assumes an objective truth and it assumes an objective reality. And we live in a time in which honesty can't be true because we live with people living based on relativistic epistemology, subjectivism. So if everything is subjective, what exactly is honesty? Honesty is what? Honesty is authentically expressing one's emotions for ulterior ends. I mean, honesty is so divorced within the contemporary context from actually articulating like things that are objectively true, because most people actually don't believe things are objectively true. So that's why trying to present facts and logic to most people, if you're getting into a political or a theological or whatever type of debate, most of the time it's useless. Why do it? You're not going to get anywhere. People aren't honest. They're not looking for honesty. They don't operate on a worldview built upon honesty. And we as Christians are called to and absolutely are supposed to do that. That's why it is such an important Christian virtue. But honesty can't exist in a relativistic world. So what is honesty? What is honesty in today's inversion? Honesty in the inverted world again is an allegiance to the agenda. Honesty isn't about something that ultimately happened. Take the example of a Yale student, the girl who claimed that she got raped and like took her mattress and like stood on campus and all this stuff. Turned out never happened. Perfect example for how today's world, the fallenness of today's world in the society we live in, inverts honesty is that it's not that, the fact that never happened wasn't a problem. It's the fact that it's actually happening to other people, right? So it's not, it was totally dishonest for her to say that this whole story happened and claim national recognition for it, go on mainstream news, talk about all this stuff, find out it never happened. So we would say, oh, well, she's a liar. That's dishonest. Well, in the modern context, in the inverted context, no, she's not, because what she's doing is she's speaking for all the other oppressed victims and all the women who are silent. And so even though it didn't happen to her, it's true generally speaking, and therefore it's just fine. That is the world that we live in. And so honesty, the sort of inversion of honesty, is just a parroting of the narrative. And so it's really, honesty is like an allegiance to the narrative. This is the modern day inversion of honesty. Honesty is complete allegiance and devotion to the narrative, because if you're to use real honesty, it is so fundamentally in opposition to their worldview in the first place, they're going to attack you. I mean, that's why they crucified Christ. It was that truth came and became a person and began to speak truth, who is the source of truth, and they killed him for it. That is also true for the situation in which we find ourselves right now, unfortunately. And so honesty in today's inverted context has nothing to do with objective truth, because they don't believe in objective truth. Honesty is an allegiance to the institution. And so honesty means to not present a false image of oneself, as our Orthodox article said. How many people are not presenting a false image of themselves in contemporary society? You go on any dating website, and it's not that we can't present the best version of ourselves. That's fine. That's understandable. That's commendable. But in today's society, with the Instagram models, with the e-girl celebs, with the whole fake reality, is that everybody's producing a false image of themselves. Ultimately, as our article said, that is being hypocritical. You are a hypocrite by doing that. And so we live in a world in which, to be honest, right? I just want to be honest with people. And I want to be a social media, content creator. And so they're always creating content about themselves, about their life. But how honest are they as real people in regards to not presenting a false image, being genuine as an individual? Not too many. not too many. And so honesty, again, repackaged, inverted in the contemporary context to the point where power is the only thing objective. I would say for most people operating in a leftist paradigm politically or just paradigmatically speaking, the only thing objective is power. The only thing objective is power. So anyways, that's all I have to say about honesty. The next Christian virtue is humility. Humility, one we can all grow in, except for I'm the most humble, so I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. So humility is often called the mother of virtues within Orthodoxy. We're always called to be humble servants of Christ. And so let me pull up our article, humility. Yes. The wise, honest person is one who is humble. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoils with the proud. A man's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will retain honor. Humility. According to the gospel, in the song of the Virgin, the Lord scatters the proud in the imagination of their hearts and exalts those who are humble and meek. This is the exact teaching of Jesus. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Humility does not mean degradation or remorse. It does not mean affecting some sort of demeaning external behavior. It does not mean considering oneself as the most vile and loathsome of creatures. Christ himself was humble, and he did not do this. God himself, according to the spiritual tradition of the church, has perfect humility, and he certainly does not act in this way. And I would love that, and that's why I wanted to start our conversation on humility with that. Because when I think about, I was trying to come up with examples of contemporary examples of humility. How would the left, how would the progressives exude humility in the contemporary context? And what kept coming back to my mind is humility would have been the sort of climate change extremists, the alarmists, the radical tree huggers of this sort, which actually demean and demonize humanity, right? They're continually degrading our importance. Somehow, we're relegated to equal with that of more primitive animals. And in fact, we're the main problem on the planet. And we could probably, as Christians, we could probably agree with many of the fallenness in regards to the characteristics of humanity, but the way in which they exude humility is an absolute destruction of us being made in the image of God. Think about that. And I think this is going to it's going to be really insightful when we think about how humility is being inverted. When we are humble within a Christian context, what are we doing? We're authentically recognizing the authority of God and submitting to it in a multitude of ways. So we can be humble to others, which is certainly a good way. Humility in the ultimate sense is humility in regards to God, which I think then bleeds into our humility and how we encounter and act with others. But humility is not a degradation of oneself. True humility at a theological context would be to recognize one's own divinity and then humbly repent to the source of that divinity, of whom's image you're made in. So then humility is sort of recognizing one's own privileged status among creation. Ironic, right? Ironic. Christian humility actually elevates the individual. It actually, and I don't want to say individual, I should say person, because of our person, operation, essence. So I should say person or personhood. But interestingly, when you think about it, Orthodoxy elevates the individual in the name of humility, in the name of the correct authority, descent of authority between us and God, between creation and God. What does modern progressives do in regards to humility? It destroys the aspects of man that reflect the image of God. So instead of highlighting what we can do and potentially change for the correct ordering of nature, of reality, of society, what does the modern leftist do? They want to annihilate humanity. They want to talk about how terrible we are. They want to talk about how dumb we are. They want to talk about how much better the world would be without us, how animals are more in tune with the harmony of nature. And to a degree, if we're going to get into sort of like natural cycles and stuff like that, yeah, we can agree, but that's because, again, they are at a different ontological order than we are. Animals are not Homo sapiens, even within your evolutionary framework, which we don't believe in, but theoretically the person I'm debating does. They believe in a total ontological distinction in abilities. Now, their inabilities, I should say, because ontologically they believe in this evolutionary, so we don't really have ultimately, we only have a unique status in the sense of evolved capabilities, not of ultimate importance. So we would disagree there. But humility for them, it's like it's like self-flagellation. This is what it reminded me of, is when you think of like Catholicism, and one of the ways in which Orthodoxy does not condone sort of worship or repentful behavior, is we don't get into the self-flagellation. We think that's a destruction, again, of the image of God, right? If you're sitting there slapping yourself with a whip and you're cutting up your back and you're bruising yourself and you're destroying your own body, that clearly isn't a worship of God. Can't be. And so when we see the sort of flagellating behavior of individuals that was present within Catholicism, I think we see that same presupposition underpinning much of the progressive, the New Age, the spiritual, not religious, is when it comes to humility. Because think about their worldview. Their worldview ultimately is they are God. You can't even say anything more braggadocious, more egotistical, more narcissistic, if you will, of what, many of us were in those places. So we can't totally fault them, because many of us were there as well. But their humility continually is the destroying of the things that actually make us unique. Because what ultimately what they're wanting to do is take us back to equal with the animals, whether they're conscientious of it or not. At least this is how I'm perceiving it as a Christian, as the rhetoric to destroy the image of God being made in the image of man, being made in the image of God. I'm sorry. And ultimately, true humility is to man and women to recognize us being made in the image and then to repent and realign that correct authority. What they do is they destroy that image over and over and over. And so, by destroying that image, they literally are trying to make man become more and more and more animalistic, more animal-like, more of an embodiment of those primitive characteristics, because it's those higher, more refined characteristics that we're going to, again, associate with the energies of God, with the energies of the Logos: logic, reason, language, love, honor, right? Responsibility, wisdom, compassion, that type of stuff. Like those. Anyways, humility also, last thing I want to say is humility cares about the least. And so the last thing I wanted to say in regards to how I see humility being inverted in a way is look at modern progressive, rhetoric or whatnot. You take the new presidential candidate, or not candidate, but actual president. Take Biden and his administration, and the rhetoric of always looking out for the most unfortunate, for the most oppressed, for the most disenfranchised, right? And wanting to lift up the least among us. They use that same rhetoric, of which you can see is a total inversion of the Christian, of the message of Christ. Why do they invert? Because Christ is the truth. And the words he spoke are true. Therefore, they do resonate with the people who hear them. But Biden, and again, every communist who has uttered the same sort of inverted Christian rhetoric in the name of the working class, is that they want to talk about caring for the least among us, of which Christianity, Orthodoxy says is a true aspect of humility. A true dimension of humility is actually to care about the least among us, because if you don't care about the least among you, that barrier that's separating you is probably rooted in some type of pride, which is going to be in opposition to, again, the humility thing. So true humility then cares about the least among us. And you look at communism or the Biden administration, who's going to be most disenfranchised by the majority of their economic, of their political ideals? The poorest people, the most, the most distraught people in the country right now. They're the ones that are hurt by the lockdown. They're the ones that are hurt even harder. And so you see the inversion of humility is the rhetoric about caring about the least among us, which is tied to being humble, is just a way to manipulate people because their actual agenda is totally in counter to the best interest of those poor people. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's interesting. So the next one is obedience. The next concept that Christian virtue that I want to go over is obedience. And so how do we as Christians understand obedience? Well, and speaking of Christ's humility, St. Paul said that Jesus was obedient to God his Father unto death and even unto the cross. In truth, Jesus obeyed God in all that he did. All that Jesus has and is, he has received from God the Father. From all eternity, the Son has listened to the Father in order to do his work and to accomplish his will. The will of God is that the Son should become a man, take up the sins of the world, and die in the flesh in order to raise the dead that, quote, nothing would be lost, unquote. Jesus has accomplished this in divine and perfect obedience, giving the example to us all. There is no degradation in obedience to God, nothing shameful or demeaning. On the contrary, to do the will of God is glory and life. It is the highest dignity of man, his greatest joy and delight. It is the way of perfection for all, even for the man Jesus himself. And so this is reference to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 through 9. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of salvation to all who obey him. Disobedience to God and his Son Jesus Christ is the source of all sin. Refusal to submit to God in all things is the cause of all sorrow and death. Those who hear the gospel and fail to enter into the eternal rest of God do so only, quote, because of disobedience, unquote. In the Orthodox spiritual tradition, obedience is a basic virtue. Obedience to the Lord, to the gospel, and to the church, to the leaders of the church, and to one's parents and elders, to every ordinance of man, or, quote, to one another out of reverence for Christ, unquote, reference to Ephesians chapter 6:21. There is no spiritual life without obedience, no freedom or liberation from sinful passions and lusts. To submit to God's discipline in all of its human forms is the only way to obtain, quote, the glorious liberty of the children of God, unquote. God disciplines us as his children out of his great love for us. He disciplines us for our good, that we might share his holiness. Reference that Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3. So, fully submitting your free will to God's divine will. This is how the church understands the virtue of obedience. How is the idea of my free will submitting to the will of God being inverted in the contemporary world? And I think that an easy way is that we live in a world, and I've said this over and over, so this is nothing new for you guys, but we live in a world that worships itself. We live in a world where people worship themselves. And so because of that, how could they ever come to the point of realigning their own will with that of God, with that of a transcendent reality, with that of a higher authority? Much of the New Age and the spiritual but not religious reaffirm the idea that they are God. Much of paganism affirms this. Some are more dualistic than others, but one idea that I thought was really interesting in regards to obedience is when we think about the obedience of evil. How does evil establish its own obedience, right? The basis of obedience from a Christian theological perspective is the free will of the individual to align their will with the will of God. That is not so in a hierarchy of evil. It's not that an individual choosing to do evil is aligning their will with the hierarchy of evil. To a degree, they are. But I want to highlight something that's a little bit more interesting than that, is what actually gives, if evil itself is sin and evil itself is chaos is death, all these different attributes, right? How then does evil organize its own hierarchy? Clearly, it has a very organized hierarchy. Clearly, it's very efficacious in that organization. So how does it do that? And I think, obviously, the motivating factor is greed. So greed pulls the whole process forward. And then deceit, backstabbing, is like, it sort of gives it its form. Now think about this. If in the hierarchy up to Satan, every individual on that rung wants to be above the individual in front of them, not based on meritocracy or deservingness or worthiness or anything like that. It's out of pure greed. They want more power. They want more money. They want something. So if we look at the hierarchy of evil all the way up to Satan, the whole hierarchy is individuals wanting whatever is in front of them, wanting what the person has in front of them, all the way up to eventually somebody wanting to be Satan. And so the whole thing is built on this greed of wanting to essentially have what the person in front of you has, which leads to a whole hierarchy of everybody wanting to backstab each other. And the fear and the knowledge that the other person does want to backstab you actually gives it a cohesive form. Maybe I could be wrong, but I just was sitting and thinking about that idea the other day. I was like, wow, that was actually pretty interesting. That the recognition that you live or exist in a hierarchy of deceit in which everybody around you is competing for what you have, you're competing for what you don't have or to take from somebody else, and everybody knows that everybody would backstab each other to get what they want. That when you think about it, that is sort of driving the game, the hierarchy of evil itself, as opposed to obedience, correct submission in the authority of God, is that true obedience, true humility, in regards to a hierarchy moving back to the Trinity, we don't want to be in front of the other person if we don't deserve it. So the whole hierarchy is like authentic meritocracy, authentic sort of deservingness and justice. Again, because it's obviously divinely inspired. It's the hierarchy of God. But I thought that's so interesting how that's very different from the sort of hierarchy of evil, and just thinking about that. So the hierarchy of evil then, although there is a sort of meritocratic element to it, like we talked about the evil genius archetype before, and the sort of worship of pride and intellect as an archetype, and looking at examples of that, looking how Satan, the most beautiful, the most handsome, the most intelligent of the created angels, and then look what happened. And so we see that same pernicious cycle, but in one way or another, and I think we're seeing it now with the progressivism or the sort of communism 2.0 that we're underneath now, is the total rejection of meritocracy, because meritocracy assumes objectivity, and essentially they're in opposition to objectivity to one degree. So the people moving up the ranks of power, like look at all the people that the Biden administration has put into prominent positions of power. Is it because of their meritocratic abilities, to their skills, their talents? Of course not. Of course not. In fact, a lot of times they have nothing to do with what they're being in charge of, because the hierarchy of evil isn't about meritocracy. It's about submission. And so if you fully submitted to the hierarchy, well, then you get promoted. In fact, if you're incompetent, you may get promoted as well. Total inversion of the hierarchy of God. I think, again, very interesting that we, in the hierarchy of God, full humility, full obedience, we do not want to be anywhere above or behind, or maybe behind, but we certainly don't want to be further along or be given something that we don't rightly deserve. We wouldn't want that. So that kind of concludes my discussion on obedience there. The next one is patience. Patience. This is one that I definitely need to get better at. This is probably the virtue that, again, I need to work on all of them, as we all do. But patience, I tend to not be the most patient person in the world. So patience, to be obedient in all things to God, requires the virtue of patience. St. Paul lists the virtue as one of the, quote, fruits of the Spirit. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. Christ himself, in his humble obedience to God, was exceedingly patient. To be patient literally means to suffer and endure. It means to wait on the Lord through all tribulations and trials with courage and hope. It means to put up with oneself and others, growing gradually in the grace of God through the daily effort to keep his commandments and to accomplish his will. Only those who are patient, according to Christ, will bring forth fruit from the seeds of God's word that are sown in their hearts. Now, I think this is easily something that we, again, see has been inverted in contemporary times. Again, patience is difficult for anybody, but how is patience defined as a Christian virtue in the Orthodox Church? It is literally, it says to be patient literally means to suffer and endure. So patience in a Christian theological context is tied to the concepts of suffering and enduring. And so with that definition, now we can place it onto contemporary society. When we look at contemporary society, do we see people being patient in regards to suffering and enduring the world? And I would say absolutely not. So what we see is a culture of immediate gratification, which I think most of us would recognize and agree with. That's no mystery or a unique idea there. That's fairly obvious. We live in a society of immediate gratification, but it's also about comfortness and commodities and all these different things which give us a sense of complacency. You know, that how much suffering and enduring are most people willing to put up with? How much are people willing to engage with? I would say not much suffering and not much enduring. And so when we look at it, as that article we're reading said, it means to put up with oneself and others. So you suffer and you endure other people, right? Now let's point that into contemporary society. Do you think there's much patience being exuded by social media companies that are banning people for particular opinions? You know, that doesn't seem like much suffering or enduring. But just people in general, I don't think people are suffering and enduring much for anything. As soon as it becomes uncomfortable, as soon as it becomes inconvenient, people are pretty quick to give up. And so the whole idea of suffering and enduring being a virtue, it's absent, I would say, from the majority of people in the world. This is one of the reasons why bodybuilding and working out within the Orthodox context, I've seen Orthodox priests mention this, isn't me coming up with it, but talking about how it itself can be a sort of ascetic act because of the patience it takes to build one's body, to work on one's body, the delayed gratification, and the sort of ascetic behavior you have to not engage in or indulging in various behaviors or appetites to maintain that. Now, it can lead to pride. It can lead to narcissism. It can lead to multiple problems with one's ego. But I've also, again, there's videos you can watch of Orthodox priests talking about how physical fitness, taking care of one's body, these can actually be understood as ascetic practices. And so I think that idea of delayed gratification, which we see a lot of people willing to not engage with as much anymore. So same thing with reading for long periods of time. I'd say the working out, taking care of your body for men, and then the reading for long periods of time. These are easier ways in which we, almost fun ways to exude patience in a way, because it takes a while to
build up that body of knowledge, just like it takes a while to build up your actual body. But I wanted to read some of the things in this article that I actually thought were really good. So, too often people embarking on the spiritual life forget that patience is a virtue, and that because of man's freedom, the effort to cleanse one's life from sin is tiresome and it's long. Everything is expected at once with little striving and small effort. Too often also, people who wish to be patient forget that the virtue is a grace of God and a fruit of the Spirit. They think that they can attain patience with themselves and with others by their willpower alone. By rationalizations and human considerations, such people never find peace for their souls. The virtue of patience is found in the steadfast endurance given by God. It is the power to, quote, stay on the cross, unquote, no matter what, doing only the will of the Lord. Patience is united with hope, faith, love, humility, and obedience, which alone brings the strength to go on. It must be renewed daily through fasting, prayer, and communion with God and the church. It is found when one trains oneself to remember God, to abide in Christ, to see all things in the light of the kingdom of God. If one wishes to be patient, one must be united with Christ and live by the power of the Spirit. So, we are called to be patient. It is very difficult to be patient. Patient obviously tests our other virtues, our faith, our hope, our obedience to God. We have to be willing and keep in mind that suffering and enduring are tests, are things that are absolutely part of our Christian life, and not something to shy away from. So that really kind of sums up. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say in regards to patience, I say, because we live in such a world with immediate gratification, one of the questions I thought was worthy to pose to people was, we're always asking for God, given we're in a world of immediate gratification, it doesn't mean that we're not continually asking God for things. We're always asking for things. But because of a lack of patience, I wonder how many people fail to actually see the answers God provides for our prayers. That if our sort of focus is limited to the immediate moment, and it's always focused so immediate in time, it's going to prevent us from ultimately seeing how God answers our requests, God answers our prayers, and God looks after us, because it's going to take time to see that. We're going to have to be patient for all that stuff to come into our purview. So just wanted to say that in regards to patience. And so that's kind of the last thing I wanted to say there. The next virtue is one that I think all of us need to discuss real quick, especially in the current age and the current time, and that is courage. Courage. To feel fear and not be afraid. To feel fear and not be afraid. So courage is another Christian value, or Christian virtue. I'm sorry, it is value. It's a Christian virtue. That the virtue of courage and strength must accompany patience. Only the one who has courage can be truly patient in all things. To be courageous means simply not to be afraid. Many times in the gospel, Christ speaks of the virtue and commands to his disciples. In so doing, he follows the Old Testament example of the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. Psalm 27. So the apostles were utterly courageous and counseled all men to follow their example. Be vigilant, stand firm in your faith, and be courageous and be strong. Corinthians chapter 16. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you will be able to stand. Ephesians chapter 6. You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. Take your share of sufferings as a good soldier of Christ. Let me reiterate that one, because it's coming. You then, my son, Be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. Take your share of sufferings as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. 2 Timothy was the first part, and the second part was Hebrews chapter 11. The virtue of courage is expressed not only in terms of persecution and suffering, but also in the face of ridicule and disdain. And it's expressed as well simply in the smallest, most common things, everyday life. In Christ's parable of the talents, the man with little lost even the little that he had, and was cast into darkness because he failed to use his small gift through a lack of courage. And I was, quote, afraid and hid my talent in the ground, unquote, Matthew chapter 25. The person with courage faces all things with strength and lives every day and every little thing with the power of Christ. To be faithful in little is a sign of great courage. The saints were eminently courageous in their lives and considered this virtue to be central in the spiritual life. Courage, according to St. Gregory of Sinai, is the first of your, quote, 4 original virtues, one of the 4 parent virtues which contain and constitute all virtues. And so St. Isaac of Syria wrote, if you wish to make a right beginning in your spiritual activity, first prepare yourself for the temptations that will befall you. For the devil has the habit of visiting with terrible temptations those whom he sees starting a righteous life with ardent faith. Therefore, prepare yourself to meet courageously the temptations which will surely assail you, and only then begin to practice them. So, courage, I would say, to feel fear and not be afraid. We are certainly facing times in which courage is going to be called out amongst us. So men of courage are going to be greatly needed. And for too many, fear is not resisted enough, but actually continually is used to navigate the world. And I'd say this is how courage has actually become inverted. Courage now is the courage to move in opposition to God's will, which is really going to be in a movement consistent with the world. So let's look at pride festivals. So what we as traditional Christians would deem as sort of sexual immorality is considered to be a courageous act by those who engage in such an act to go out publicly and promote those activities. So whether you agree with it or not. And there is a sense of pride and great courage to come out of that closet, right? And to establish who you are, right? Who you really are, how you really feel. And this is celebrated. This is celebrated as authentic courage in the world. However, when in the same token, as soon as you look at fear, and we look at, let's just take the pandemic that we've been faced up against, too many people actually, the way that courage is inverted is it's not about feeling fear and not being afraid. Courage, because so few of people actually would stand in opposition to the world, right? What we're seeing right now is a absolute depletion, a calling, a desperate need of men with courage. That our country, and sadly, most places of authority throughout the world are filled with men with a lack of real courage. Trump presented remnants of real courage when he talked about draining the swamp, right? Because courage, from our understanding, has to do with standing up against the world in face of what is wrong for what is right. But courage, the way that is inverted, is people for actually doing what is wrong in opposition to what is right. That's why I was highlighting sort of sexual immorality as a way for pride and courage to be exemplified in the modern world, as opposed to standing up in regards to tyrannical power, standing up and speaking real truth to larger, maybe conspiratorial agendas of one sort or another. That courage isn't what we would consider it to be. Instead, people are manipulated by fear because they don't have a real sense of courage. The real sense of courage being that you feel fear, but you don't act on it, but you're not afraid. most people feel fear and then they act on it. So look at COVID, look at the fear, look at the mask, look at the how the readiness for people to give over their freedoms, to give over all the things that maybe their ancestors had worked for in the name of fear. Are they resisting fear? Right? What are we called to as Christians? You and I are literally called to fear only God. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to experience fear, because we'll experience fear all the time, but are we to give into it? Absolutely not. And yet, look all around us, at our own parishes, at our own families, our friends, the people we care about are living in a state of fear. And that fear totally manipulates them and corrals them like sheep, like a herded animal, to move in a particular direction, in which that direction is what they perceive to be courageous. You see what I'm saying? That these people, through fear, they're herded, they're manipulated, they're organized, and then they're funneled into particular directions, and moving in those directions that they have been manipulated and funneled to move towards, they perceive that as courageous. And so all you have to do is look then at progressive values, progressive morals. Look at, the new form of courage. Go get your COVID-19 vaccine. Be courageous, right? The future is female. It's just it's so obvious once you see it. That's why I like doing these types of videos, is that the dialectic, the dichotomy, the bifurcation, the dual, it's so easy to see. Once this concept, courage, this is how we understand it in the Christian tradition. Now let's look at the modern world and we see, oh, wow, it is literally inverted. Everything about how we define the concept is literally inverted. And so courage is to face things, all things, as the Orthodox definition said, is to face all things with strength. Courage is to face all things with strength. That is literally now the definition of toxic masculinity, right? Which is the point, because the enemy, the world that is inverting all of our Christian values, wants people to perceive themselves as being courageous by moving along with the official narrative and agenda. So they perceive themselves to actually be courageous, but that's not courageous. What would be courageous would be to stand up in opposition to that, standing up for what is right, trying to be a voice of tradition and what God educates us on. But that would be toxic masculinity. So the way in which courage is actually redefined and inverted in the contemporary context prevents people from using it in the correct context, because that would immediately be redefined as toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity. And that's why men need to really move beyond name calling as anything that would affect the way in which they go and live their lives at the beta male. And that's why I was going to tie this to a larger concept of the beta male, as I said at the outset of the stream, that I changed it because I didn't want to turn people off. I didn't want to prevent certain people from joining. So, but we can see how courage has been totally inverted. It has nothing to do with standing up for what is right, what is just, and standing up in opposition to evil. Courage now, as we see with the pride, is to really move in opposition to God, be consistent with the world, have the world revalidate and affirm everything that you're doing, and somehow that is courageous. Courage is to literally cut off your own testicles and reassign your own gender by surgery and take hormones to alter the natural structure of one's endocrine system. That's courage. Not to actually be the best and fullest man and woman you can be. So we see absolutely inverted understandings. Guys, can you please smash that like as we move on to the next topic? If you can, would love to get this over 100 likes. If you could, please smash that like if you hadn't. So that is really courage. And then, so because we have few men that have true courage to face the world. And guys, that's what we're up against. So, it's kind of like do or die. I mean, who knows the timeline of any of this stuff, but the sides are defined, and wherever you choose, I think, is going to be a very important decision for all of us, and how many of us are going to have the courage to stand up for tradition and the things that we say we believe in. It's going to be quite difficult. So that is courage. The next thing that I want to talk about after courage is faithfulness. Faithfulness. Okay. So faithfulness is to be absolutely true with one's word. Faithfulness. So I was a little confused on what faithfulness was going to be when I first started, and had to read a little bit from what the article said. It said, according to the scriptures, one of the main characteristics of God is his absolute faithfulness. The virtue in man is also considered to be one of the true fruits of the Holy Spirit. To be faithful means to be absolutely true to one's word, to be totally loyal in one's devotion, to be completely steadfast and unswerving in one's own calling and vocation. It means to remain in humble service, in truth, and in love, no matter what the conditions or consequences. To be faithful means to be courageous and to be and to do that which one must be and to do by God's will, regardless of any rejection by others and in spite of any lack of recognition or appreciation. God himself is perfectly faithful. He has made promises and declared covenants, keeping his word no matter what man does. When men are adulterous and faithless, God remains faithful. For the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. So, faithfulness, then, I think this one I don't think we need to spend too much time on discussing. It kind of co-alongs with much of what has been said with some of the previous virtues. Faithfulness being tied with a sort of following through, right? A following through with one's word, a following through with one's vocation, with one's calling that God has bestowed upon you as an individual, as a person made in the image. So faithfulness is really about a continuation and a following through. And that's something that I think all of us can add more to in our lives, is that we want our word to be our bond, right? And so one ways in which our words are absolutely true would be how we stand in opposition to the father of lies. Again, tied back to what I was talking about in regards to wisdom and honesty is again, Satan, the devil, Lucifer is the father of lies, and how we see the rhetoric, magic, the way in which people are continually being misled and led away from God by the world is through false promises, is through the father of lies. And so one ways in which we can literally, on a one-to-one level, combat the devil, fight in the spiritual war, is to really take seriously our word and how we use our word, right? How we use the thing in which we're made in the image of God. How truthfully do we speak? How do we use our thoughts, our language? How do we communicate to people? What are the topics of conversation? What's the depth of communication? These are things that we should think about. And I think by becoming more conscientious at this level, it's one way we can think about sort of combating the father of lies. Is that one way we can fight the father of lies is to be extra cautious that we don't contribute to them. And we can make sure we don't contribute to them through a multitude of ways. And I think the Q phenomenon is one way. Now, hindsight 2020, many people can become more discerning in the way in which they promote information or consume things, and try to combat, again, the father of lies. Because what we saw with Q was really a manipulation of people's patriotism, their pride, and all these different things. And essentially, they all fell for the lie. And so we must be men of our word. We must think about that. We are men of the word. We are men of the logos. And we therefore need to be men of our words, our ways in which we communicate to the world, that we try to set order into place into the world. And so what are the things that stand in opposition to faithfulness? I thought this was interesting and useful to share, and I'll probably end on this, is pride, covetousness, cowardice, envy, and the refusal to serve humbly. So faithfulness, again, the following through is that you and I, we are all given a calling, a duty, a sort of providential purpose. And for you to potentially find out what that is and then to neglect doing that, that is a rejection of the faithfulness in regards to our Christian virtues. That you are like spitting in the face of God by Him giving you something, and you really deep down are aware that this is your purpose, and you're not using it, you're not bettering it, you're not honing it, you're not sharpening it, you're not doing things in the world that promote God's glory through the skills in which you have been given. That is a failure to act in faithfulness. And so that is the last, or not the last, but that is the last I have to say about that. The next one is self-control. Self-control. And so let me read to you guys what the article discussed on self-control. Self-control is also listed by the Apostle Paul as a, quote, fruit of the Spirit. The virtue is one of which is not often easily attained because people forget, like patience, it is a grace of God that they must seek it from the Lord. Instead, they seek it from, they seek it from, I totally lost my place. Make patience is grace from God. They must seek it from the Lord. Instead, they think that they can come from human effort and willpower alone. Self-control is one of the main characteristics of God and is one of the main gifts to man as created in God's image. According to the saints, self-control is one of the main elements of the divine image in man, coextensive with the gift of freedom, which is often explained as the essential and basic element of man's likeness to his creator, which one is perfectly free by the grace of God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. There is also perfect control over oneself. And so this is easily one in which we see inverted in contemporary society. We live in a hedonistic world. So self-control is not valued at all in any way, I would argue, within our society. And so self-control, from what we just read, is the main element of the divine image of man. The divine image of man. And the idea that I've highlighted this before, but those of you who may be familiar with the former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink, he has a very popular podcast, but he has this phrase, discipline equals freedom. Discipline equals freedom. And that is totally consistent with our Orthodox theology, with Christian theology, that it is through self-control that we actually attain freedom. And that, again, that article was highlighting how these things come together. And so that self-control, again, I love how it related to the self-control as one of the main ways in which we're made in the image of God, because God is so expansive. Think about it. Like, it can literally be anywhere, anytime. Like, it's so omnipotent, and yet it's one of its greatest qualities is its self-control. And so the self-discipline in all these different ways, right? And we've talked about you can exude self-discipline in the way that you speak, the way that you dress, the way that you interact with other people, your body, how you keep your health, all these different ways you can demonstrate self-control. And in that discipline, and it resonates in multiple aspects of one's life. But we live in a world that totally promotes hedonism, and it totally promotes hedonism as empowerment. And so self-control isn't, you really don't get a whole lot in contemporary society where self-control is celebrated. You get the drunken nights, you get the wondrous sexual adventures, you get the drug experiences, you get whatever it is. And it's just the pornography. It's never about self-control. Our society is about satiation until basically you can't take anymore. And that is when you stop. And I think it's affected and it permeates so many of our psyches that it affects so many of us on multitude of levels that I think a lot of us just aren't aware of it. So the self-control is clearly, I don't even know. I was trying to think of an inversion, like where is self-control inverted? It's not even described, articulated by the opposite. So it's not like they're even inverting it. They just don't do it, right? They advocate for the opposite of it. So it's unlike some of the other ones like honesty or wisdom, or where they suddenly invert it. So they use the same word and they invert what we mean by it. Do they even talk about self-control? I don't even think so. So it's like they don't even invert it. They don't even. But man loses control when he sells himself to sin. And I think this is a big one for many of us, that we do sell ourselves when we can't control ourselves. That again, that discipline equals freedom. That another, this is Paul said this, the Apostle Paul, that without self-control, you're enslaved. You are enslaved to the world. And I tried to highlight this in a previous stream I did on being addicted to the world. This was after a childhood friend of mine died of a heroin overdose. And the addictions that we do have to the world, that any type of addiction is an attachment. Sex, power, money, prestige, pride, your ego, your body, anything that you're too much attached of becomes an addiction and ties you back down to the fallenness of the world and separates you from God, right? That the only way to elevate the theosis, the ladder of divine ascent, is really a way of letting go of our attachments to the world in one way or another. And so that's how we attain freedom. And that's what is so paradoxical, is that the freedom of everlasting life, the freedom of living for eternity, is attained through immense self-control and discipline. That it is self-control and discipline that ultimately sets us free outside space-time. So, that's kind of my last thoughts that I wanted to share on self-control. We have two more here that I want to get through, and then I'll be reading the super chats and hopping off. The next one is kindness. So this is the next virtue that we're going to tackle, kindness. Kindness. And what does our article read about kindness? And guys, I shared this article with you guys earlier. If some of you weren't here and you'd like to see what exactly it is I'm reading or making a stream over, this is the article, and we are now down on kindness. And so it reads, the spiritual person is kind. He never practices cruelty in any of its forms, but is always gentle in his relations with others. Kindness, according to the Apostle Paul, is also a fruit of the Spirit. According to the Scriptures, God himself is kind. For all his anger and wrath over all the sins of men, the Lord is, quote, kind to the ungrateful and the selfish. Christians are urged to follow God in his kindness and to do all things gently and with tenderness, especially when we're rebuking and correcting others. The spiritual person must be kind. So, kindness. How is kindness inverted in the contemporary scheme of things? And I would say the first one is that kindness is sort of dissolved into the concept of tolerance. And so this is where I would say kindness and the Christian notion of kindness begins to get inverted, is that its meaning and its concept dissolves into tolerance. And so the toleration of the multiplicity of behaviors or dispositions towards things are all equal. Of course, that creates a sort of relativistic epistemology, but it leads to, I'm kind and a good person because I tolerate this and I tolerate that. And that if you then don't tolerate those things, you by definition can no longer be kind. Therefore, you can no longer be a nice person. And you can see how that redefinition, by moving kindness to tolerance, as soon as you don't tolerate what that person tolerates, you're no longer kind. You're no longer a nice person. It's only a few more steps and you're not even a real person. And it's only a few more steps and then all Trump supporters are in concentration FEMA camps. But that's we'll leave that for another day. So the kindness and the tolerance, I think, is the real pernicious way in which a Christian notion of kindness is inverted into our world. And so it's funny then that those who claim to be the most kind and the most tolerant are also those who are most likely to become physically violent if you actually oppose the ideas and thoughts that they promote. If you actually oppose the activities that they want to become more and more tolerant of, they don't care if you're potentially killed, murdered, or ostracized, or fired from your job, or your children starve. And again, we see all that in the name of kindness, right? Because kindness gets redefined as tolerance. Intolerant people, the only kind thing to do to intolerant people is probably to kill them. And you're going to see that logic. It's getting ready to move at a very escalated speed right now. That we're going to see the rhetoric change. We're going to see this logical progression move. And that kindness is tolerance. Tolerance is everything, really is sin in the modern context. This is how they're inverting it. And then if you actually stand in opposition to that sin, you are now intolerant. Therefore, by definition, you are an unkind person. And unkind people must be treated very harshly and very violently. And so that's one way in which we can see this being inverted. But as our article also says, kindness, if I were to go on here, I'll actually find that. I think it's at the very bottom. So kindness does not mean overlooking people's sins. It means forgiving them. Kindness also does not mean being nice to, quote, everyone, whoever they are and whatever they do. It does not mean, quote, going along with others in every way. A kind person will correct others if need be, and his very kindness will be shown by his care and concern for the well-being of other and fellow creatures of whom Christ died. And so when I read this article, where I felt like it spoke to me is I'm very good at confronting people with what I believe to be wrong, but do I do it in a kind way? And I would say not always. And oftentimes the majority of ways that I engage with people who I disagree with, it's probably not in a very kind way. And so when I read this, I thought, you know what, Patrick, you definitely, to be more like Christ, can engage people in a more kind way. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I changed the title of this stream from Beta Male Inversions of Christian Values, because I don't want the beta male to not watch the video, to potentially get new insight, to potentially change his ways, to no longer be the beta male. And so if I can do that by just, not putting so much focus or aggressive energy at like characterizing somebody or putting the categories on people, and I was like, yeah, I should probably retitle that and redefine this. So that's what I did. But kindness is something I definitely need to work on in regards to how I encounter the people who I disagree with. Because as we said, it is not overlooking sin. It is not going along to get along. It is not just agreeing with people. That is not kindness. Kindness is standing up for Christian values. It's the way in which you do it, though. And that's what I need to work on. I'm sure many of you are probably in the same boat and can work on that as well. And so that's kindness. Now we are to our last and final Christian virtue, and that is gratitude. Gratitude is our last one. And so gratitude is our last Christian virtue. We are to receive everything with thanksgiving. This is what we're called to as Christians. And so the spiritual person is one who is grateful for everything. In the Old Testament, thanksgiving was central in the life of God's people. The temple liturgy offered sacrifices and thanksgiving and praise and psalms, saying continually in thanksgiving to God. In the New Testament, thanksgiving is the very essence of the church's life. The word Eucharist means thanksgiving. And the very center of the church's liturgical worship of God is when, in remembrance of all his saving acts in Christ, the faithful lift up their hearts and give thanks unto the Lord. And so this kind of like self-control, I thought Thanksgiving isn't really one that's directly, rhetorically used and then inverted by the world so much. Maybe in regards to the gratitude, it gives thanks in regards to what we would consider to be perversions. But I asked how many people are truly thankful with their lives. And this is true for us as believers and followers of Christ, and true for all the people who aren't as well. How many of us are truly thankful for the things that we do have? I think 2020 and the COVID-19 experience, one of the things that it should have done for many of us is given us a better perspective on why we should be thankful for what we have. Because what was shown is how easily the regularities of society can be abruptly stopped, and what we were taking, what we previously were taking advantage of, or and we're not recognizing how thankful we were. We take for granted that they can be gone in just a matter of a day. And so we as Christians need to be more grateful. The world, I think, is very ungrateful. So are they inverting gratitude? I would say not really. It's kind of like self-control. Are they really ever articulating a lot of gratefulness? I mean, maybe one way in which I thought the world inverts gratitude is the way in which people refer to God as the universe, and how the universe is always caring for you. The universe wants you to succeed. The universe loves you. All this yada, 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 yada. The whole universe thing. That seems a bit like an inversion of our understanding of gratitude. But generally speaking, as a society, I don't think we're too grateful. And so I think that's probably true for us as individuals too. I know I could definitely do a better job. So how many people are truly grateful? I'd say not a whole lot. Eucharist, I mean, the point of us is to give thanksgiving. Eucharist means thanksgiving, as that article highlight. And so the message that I really wanted to end on, hold on. The message I wanted to end on is that we can all do better recognizing and vocalizing thanks to the Creator. And so I didn't have a whole lot in regard to the inversion of gratitude, like I said, but one thing I wanted to leave, we've been streaming for over 2 hours now. I wanted to leave with people is that all of us need to become better at recognizing and vocalizing thanks for the blessings that God bestows upon us. And we can, again, this is early in the year. We're early in 2021. We have a lot of chaos. We have a lot of things in front of us in this next year. Who knows where we will be in 2022, in January 2022, when we continue to have these conversations. But one thing all of us can do, and I think it's only going to better every single one of our lives, is if we deliberately become better at recognizing and vocalizing the blessings that God has bestowed upon us. And so that concludes today's stream. That was the worldly inversions of Christian values. I do need to hop off here, but I'm going to read some of the super chats. Looks like we got 2 super chats donated. Mama Llama throws in $4.99. Thank you very, very much, Mama Llama, for the $4.99. No comments, so thank you. I appreciate your love and support, and I'm glad that you're here. Philo Beto throws in $19.99 and said, inspired stream, DPH. Thoughts/recommended readings with regards to ortho perspective on what happens to non-believers after life, especially with regards to Hades as literal place of torture. Well, Philo, thank you so much, brother, for the $19.99, and thank you very much for the compliments. In regards to recommended readings for the Orthodox perspective on what happens to non-believers in the afterlife, especially in regards to Hades and the literal place of torture, I don't have a whole lot of reference for you. I would say hopefully some people in the chat can drop some book recommendations. Guys, what would you recommend, Philo? Looking for a book on the afterlife and especially what happens to non-believers in Hades. I'm sorry, brother. I just don't know of a book that's specifically addressing that topic. So I apologize not having a direct answer for you. Guys, please smash that like if you can. Would greatly appreciate that. If you haven't and you came in late, please hit that like button. Yeah, brother Philo, I am sorry, man. I know that Father Seraphim Rose has a good book on the afterlife. It kind of talks a little bit more about toll houses. I really don't know, man. I'm sorry. Departure of the Soul by Saint. I have that, but it's a huge book. It's not over there. It's over there. Yeah, The Departure of the Soul. It's like this big. I have it. It's over. My priest gave it to me. That would probably be the one to go to, actually. The Soul After Death by Father Seraphim Rose. I have that one too. The Soul After Death and The Departure of the Soul by St. Anthony's Monastery. Here, I can grab them for you. So here is The Death of the Soul by Father Seraphim Rose that they're talking about. And then this is The Departure of the Soul by St. Anthony's Monastery. Maybe for a detailed answer to your question, I'd probably recommend maybe this book. But yeah, so that's really my best response for that question, brother. I hope that suffices. Again, thank you very much for the $19.99. I appreciate it. But anyways, guys, that's going to, it doesn't look like we have any more super chats or any more questions. If you guys are enjoying, if you like what I'm trying to do over here at Church of the Eternal Logos, please go and subscribe at the website. Become a website member for $5 a month. I got a bunch of exclusive content. If you guys are interested in some of my day-to-day stuff, feel free to follow me over on Instagram. I'm always posting over there. I'm also moving much of Church of the Eternal Logos' headquarters, if you want to call it that, over to gab.com. That is going to be the home base moving forward. So if you're over there, please check me out on that. And then also, if you guys are on, if anybody's on Rumble, please go create a Rumble account and follow me. I'm creating my backup channel. So all Church of the Eternal Logos stuff is on a COTEL, C-O-T-E-L, acronym for Church of the Eternal Logos, over on rumble.com. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. Love you. I will be back either Friday or Saturday with a new stream. So again, thank you guys for all the love and support. And please smash that like, share the stream, and I will see you guys next time. As always, God bless.